a huge welcome to everyone for joining us for this third of our seminars for the Scottish Revival Network. And in this session, of course, we'll be focusing on debates around the Scottish Literary Revival and Canon. We've got four absolutely fantastic panelists for this discussion, and I hope you've had the opportunity to listen to their really insightful and stimulating talks, and I'm sure it's going to lead to a really good discussion this afternoon. Just a few pieces of housekeeping to go over. First of all, if you've been to these seminars before, you'll know roughly the structure of them, but for those who are new, I'll just go over it. So we start off with each of our panelists giving a sort of 5 minutes sort of summary of the key points that they made in their paper, just as a sort of reminder to us and to help to think about the overlaps between the papers. From there, we have a discussion between the panelists chaired by myself, which usually lasts around half an hour to 40 minutes. And then from there, we have a Q&A session where you can ask any questions of the panelists. It would be good if you are asking any questions to ask it in the Q&A session rather than the chat, just to keep it all in the one place so that myself and Scott are looking in lots of different places for different contributions. Should say as well with these, just the setup of Zoom is that the ending of the session can be a little bit abrupt towards the end, where we just have to kind of end it and everybody gets chucked out at the one point. So if you did find it a bit abrupt, it's nothing personal, it's just the form of Zoom. And should say that this session is being recorded as well, but it's just the panelists and the chairs who are being recorded. Great, so without further ado, let's get into hearing the summaries of the various papers. And we're going to go with the structure of David, then Helena, and then we'll go into Petra and Scott. So first up, we have David Goldie, who's going to summarise his paper, thinking about Glasgow novelists in relation to the Scottish Literary Revival.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael, and thanks, Scott, as well for organising this really interesting series of seminars. First, I want to start with a really grovelling apology. When I was looking over the recording, I realised that I had a kind of senior moment when I was preparing the slides. In the second or third slide, I talked about what seemed to be two John Griersons. I don't know if you noticed this. The first John Grierson was the real one, the founder of the British documentary movement. The second Grierson I mentioned was, of course, not John Grierson, but actually John Reith, the founder and the continuing Director General of the BBC. So apologies for any confusion about that. So to summarise the paper briefly, it starts from the premise that Scottish culture was in fact in fairly good health during the interwar period, at least in the sense that Scottish people had available to them a historically unprecedented range of cultural possibilities. The emergent mass media had brought cheap books and newspapers, cinema, radio, sporting events, leisure activities. And if you look at culture from the point of view of the individual Scot, there was an unprecedented diversity and a choice from the point as to how you might spend your leisure time. And if you were a cultural producer, a filmmaker, a cinema owner, a broadcaster, a writer, or a publisher, there was also an unprecedented opportunity to expand your operation into a UK and into an international market. So from this point of view, Scotland may certainly have had many economic problems in the period, and there's no getting away from this, but it actually had few impediments, I think, to cultural expression. That's the argument that I was trying to make. So the sense that Scottish culture was in crisis and that a renaissance was required was, I think, a direct response to this burgeoning of cultural choice, a reactionary fear, if you like, that something essentially Scottish was being swept away with this tide of reckless cultural production and consumption. And many of these fears were focused on the city, particularly Glasgow, which often figures in Renaissance narratives as a place that's inimical to a true, or at least an enriching sense of Scottishness. The narratives of Muir, Gunn and Macaulay are perhaps typical, I think, of the way in which they portray sensitive individuals experiencing the horror of the city and then turning their backs on it. And what I was trying to express in my paper, what I am trying to express, is a kind of regret that the Renaissance took this turn. that too often it refused to engage seriously with urban working class experience and with the new media of cinema, popular song, and popular literature. And to my mind, writers like Blake and Allen, and particularly Bark, who I think is a real gem in the period, they were making important, if not always successful, attempts to engage with this emergent hybridized culture. They were attempting to engage with a culture in which modern Scots were being shaped. Well, they were working with an understanding of the Scots were shaped by tradition and by place, but also in which people were being shaped by modern phenomena such as Hollywood cinema, cheap popular fiction, and the widespread use of the American vernacular. Now, this was occasionally a source of regret for these writers, but it was also a recognition of what was actually the case and what they had to address if they wanted to understand, rather than simply condemn these aspects of modern Scottish life. And my paper, just to conclude, my paper ends with Grasset Gibbons' essay on Glasgow, because certainly in my view, it offers a much more hopeful view of that city and a greater awareness of the cultural possibilities that a city like Glasgow offer. And in particular, it offers a kind of vision of Scotland which opens itself up to the popular and to the diverse. Gibbons' essay espouses a principle of what he identifies, and he calls it this cosmopolitanism, and it recognises the extent to which the nation gains from the diversity of its culture, not least the culture of those who live here but come from elsewhere, which is why I quoted that long section about the cosmopolitan makeup of the modern Glasgow slums. Now, this is quite striking, I think, and it's very welcome in a larger movement that tended, I think, to see the heterogeneous nature of the urban crowd and their cultural tastes as a threat to Scottish identity, rather than what I think it was actually an opportunity for the development of that identity.
Thanks very much, David. Really stimulating ideas there, which, yeah, we're going to come back to several of those and unpack them in more detail. Yeah, great. And next we move on to Helena Duncan, whose paper focused on semi-rural novelists or semi-rural settings in women's writing of the revivalist period.
Yeah, so in my talk, I wanted to just begin to introduce some of the representations of these semi-rural communities and consider sort of the nuances to these representations as well. And when I was first invited to give a talk on this topic, I went back and forth quite a lot, trying to decide whether to focus on one writer or try to sort of incorporate a few. But in the end, I decided that I wanted to provide some textual examples from three quite different writers to really demonstrate the ways that they gave these varying responses to these communities that are often in states of flux. So I spoke about Willa Muir, Nan Shepherd, and Lorna Moon. And one of the things that I wanted to consider was the ways in which the work of these writers is often balancing between some of these extremes. So between the cosmopolitan and the parochial, and between Scottish nationalism and then a drive towards the universal. And each of the writers is offering, in quite a distinct way, a repositioning of the semi-rural community, and a way in which the sites can be seen not as spaces, or not just as spaces of sentimentalism, authenticity, or domesticity, but also as really active, vibrant sites of female rebellion and parody and rebirth. So I first discussed Willa Muir. So Muir had two published novels, Imagined Corners and Mrs. Ritchie, and then a variety of non-fiction publications. Her work, particularly Imagined Corners and Mrs. Ritchie, presents these ideas of perceived internal threats which continually fracture the stability of Calderwick. So Calderwick is the town that features in her two novels. And there are elements of what Muir is depicting as an authentic Scottishness. And I often think, when I'm looking at Muir, of the description that she gives of Calderwick as a clockwork town in miniature, where some of these apparently traditional semi-rural aspects of life are going on unchanged for quite a long time. But Muir makes it quite clear that for her anyway, that particular Scottishness is no longer fit for purpose. And in her diaries and private letters, and in Mrs. Grundy in Scotland as well, Presbyterianism is noted to be at the root of many of those failings that she discusses. So for Muir, these communities are really ripe for the reevaluation of womanhood, how women can engage with religion, and how they can or can't flourish in towns such as Calderwick. In my discussion of Lorna Moon, I was keen to focus on Moon's reclamation of the rural space from the Kailyard and the tension that she creates between the narrator and the written community in her Doorways in Dromorty collection of short stories and in her novel Dark Star, which was published in 1929. So in both the short story collection and the novel, Moon really celebrates women who are rebelling against tradition and against these static communities. But as I mentioned in my paper, one of the things that I'm really interested in with Moon is how these rebellions manifest themselves when it comes to mourning and grief, and how she looks at traditional community behaviours as tactless or outdated or quite harmful. And the final writer that I discussed in my paper was Nan Shepherd. Some of Shepherd's works include The Quarry Wood, The Weather House, A Pass in the Grampians, and The Living Mountain. In discussing Shepherd's work, my paper considered the way in which her approach to semi-rural community is to celebrate traditions and to urge for the protection of nature in quite a lot of ways, but also to highlight the importance of making connections and bringing down a lot of boundaries. So Shepherd, like Moon and Muir, does consider some of the inherent, what they consider as dangers of these communities. But what Shepherd does is she also appeals for universality, and she really doesn't want to neglect Scottishness or to criticize the rural, but she instead suggests that there's a possibility to transcend Scotland whilst being undeniably, authentically Scottish. So in my discussions of each of these authors, I was keen to demonstrate the ways in which they all present semi-rural spaces as being in the midst of rupture or several ruptures all at once. And common amongst all three of them is the suggestion that these communities can be and should be spaces for a deliberate reimagining of what Scottishness and womanhood can mean in a semi-rural space.
Thank you very much, Helena. And yeah, I love the concept of the semi-rural just as a framing for geography. I think it's actually really useful for engaging with a lot of Scottish literature from this period. Fantastic. Next up, we have Petra Poncarová, who's going to be, who has delivered a paper that focuses on Gaelic writing, particularly with Rudy Erskine of Marr and Derek Thompson.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Jim, for the organization and all the support. For my talk, I decided to focus on Rudy Erskine of Marr, Derek Thompson, and what I call the structures of Gaelic revival. I try to outline the structural parallels and similarities of outlook between their activities aimed at promoting Gaelic, thus covering most of the 20th century. And also to draw attention to the phenomenon of a magazine founded by one personality with a strong vision as to how should Gaelic be revived. And these magazines becoming sort of revivalist hubs that facilitated other activities such as production of new writing and criticism, literary competitions, but also publishing and language classes, which is a feature of the Gaelic revival that was first identified by Donald John MacLeod in his 1969 thesis. In both cases, there was also a decided conviction that Gaelic cultural and linguistic revival is vital for the political emancipation of Scotland and vice versa, and a consistent and critical interest in the developments in Ireland, especially, but also in Wales, Brittany, the Isle of Man, and also in non-Celtic European literatures and cultures, especially minoritized ones, but not only. I attempted to point out the actual strong link between Erskine and Thompson, which has not received much critical attention so far, and their impact on shaping the development of Gaelic literature in terms of both genres and thought routines. When I was preparing for the seminar, I realized that I did not manage to say much about the general topic, the canon, for which I apologize, and now is my chance to make up for it, I suppose. In relation to the Gaelic canon, I think it is revealing that both Thompson and Erskine, they're seeking to promote specific tendencies in it and to invite specific people to join and to diversify it. And these preferences allow one to follow a distinct trajectory that focuses on intellectual qualities, high standards, and international inspirations. In Thompson's case, it is also evident from his scholarly work. There is a strong preference for intellectual and politically engaged Gaelic writers, such as Alistair MacAlister, Alexander MacDonald, or Ian McAhoy, John Smith of Yarshiatar. Erskine was bringing forward the Catholic dimension, disrupting partly the strong association between Gaelic and the evangelical churches. He is also one of the first examples of a writer and activist who learned the language and decided to work in it and campaign on its behalf, setting a vital precedent. And Thompson, who of course grew up in a Gaelic-speaking environment in Lewis, was consistently supporting people from the outside, both from Scotland and internationally, who learned the language and were willing to engage with it. In relation to Helena's stimulating talk, I also wanted to comment on the gender aspect. Erskine's magazines were almost completely masculine, and you could really count the women contributors on the fingers of one hand. And his texts offer interesting possibilities for the study of gender anxieties at the Fantasiego. In Thompson's Garam, in contrast, we encounter decided support of women writers and contributors. Apologies, my cat is distracting me. And Garam, the quarterly, was openly inviting more women to contribute, reminding both potential contributors and all the readers about the great Gaelic women writers of the past and of their readiness to speak out also on political topics, from Marin Alastair Roy to Mary Vorna Noran. And when one looks on the contents of Garam over the years, the increase is really marked. And the presence of women writers in Garam is a topic I would like to devote more attention to in the future. Both Erskine and Thompson were also concerned with what they perceived as deficiencies within the Gaelic canon and the unfulfilled potential for the revival, especially when it comes to drama and fiction, but also importantly, and I think this ties in really nicely to what David was talking about, genre reading to increase the competitiveness of Gaelic. For me, it is curious that Erskine and Thompson, to a much lesser extent, seem to be curiously outside the Gaelic canon, also in terms of critical reception, although research has been emerging on both of them recently. And I think that one possible explanation is exactly their high demands, their readiness to criticize tendencies they disagreed with, their radical and progressive notions, also their association with the city environment, and in both cases, admitted tendency towards elitism and preference for intellectual and cosmopolitan impulses, which was curiously balanced by very pragmatic approaches, shrewdness and readiness to work in popular genres to further the Gaelic cause. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Petra, and no need to apologise for cat appearances, as many as we can get. And very last speaker doesn't need much in the way of introduction. Of course, is the PI of the project, Scott Lyall, has been presented on criticism on the revival and the way that it's been theorised over the past century.
Thank you very much, Michael. So I thought it was important to try to capture some of the critical perspectives on the idea of revival, although my talk concentrated in the main on critical discussions of the Scottish literary renaissance of the early 20th century. And there was some false advertising in the original title of my talk with its claim that I'd concentrate on contemporary critical appraisals of revival and renaissance, when actually, when I got down to it, I thought it might be useful to go back to how these moments and ideas were assessed from around the time of the so-called second wave of the Renaissance, when Kirk Whittock publishes the Scottish Tradition in Literature, although I do work my way towards more recent critics. As I say in the talk itself, the choice of critics is necessarily potted, and I also didn't want to simply exclude certain critical voices in order to be able to present a kind of strong but somewhat perhaps somewhat lopsided argument. Also, as a side note, apologise for my verbal slip in calling G. Gregory Smith G. Gregory Scott. I'll just blame that one on the antisyzygy. So I start by looking briefly at how Renaissance was represented by Patrick Geddes and Hugh McDermott and Edwin Muir. And in Geddes' The Scots Renaissance, I argue that we see some of the key ideas that would continue to define Scottish Renaissance subsequently. So firstly, the notion of the ever recurrence of revival, the way that Renaissance plays out as an ever present in the 20th century in Scottish literary culture. Secondly, the fusing of cultural and political revival, or the confusing of cultural and political nationalisms, which I characterise in the terms Renaissance and Rising, which Scott Hames has, of course, cast a sceptical eye on more recently in his book, The Literary Politics of Scottish Devolution, although he concentrates mostly on a later period. And thirdly, the idea that revival will heal a decadent culture, a culture in decline, or to put that another way, the proposition that the culture is decadent and therefore requires reviving. And in a sense, that was something that David was concentrating on in his talk for this event. And these points would certainly be reproduced in even more powerful or exaggerated forms in the work of McDermott and Edwin Muir, which various critics, and I mentioned Michael Gardner from the Cultural Roots of British Devolution here, have pointed out assumes as ideal a notion of cultural holism or an unbroken tradition, which our own critical period has come to distrust, hence the movement towards increasingly negative appraisals of the Renaissance in the later stages of my talk as I move towards more contemporary critics. Kurt Wittig's book indicates some of the paradoxes of the configuring of the Scots tradition in relation to a model of Renaissance as its necessary saviour or eternal endpoint, as he suggests that there is a tradition, but brokenly or intermittently so, which comes and goes like the seasons of the years. Now, this means that the chronologies of tradition are both time-bound and timeless, cyclical and linear, moving back in order to move forward to recover. And the roots of recovery are to be found in the Scots language and a proper sense of Scottishness. So this belongs in the tradition and that does not belong. Subsequently to Wittig, I look at various critics who posit the idea of decline and a broken tradition. So David Craig, for instance, thinks Renaissance is essentially impossible due to the population hemorrhage caused by emigration and the subsequent sentimentalism encouraged by exile. George Bruce assumes nothing of note has happened in the tradition from the death of Burns until Grieve creates McDermott in 1922, as well as thinking that the 20th century sees a permanent revival of Scots poetry. While Francis Russell Hart also assumes that the Scottish tradition has its back against the wall, but it can be saved by a political and economic nationalism that was, for him, engendered by the literary renaissance of the 1920s. As I move into analysis of more recent critics, the picture largely becomes one in which they are either seeking the assimilation of Renaissance writers into a wider modernist canon. Robert Crawford and Marjorie Palmer McCulloch have the same, I would say, and this seeks the internationalization of Scottish literary studies as well as the Scotification of modernist studies, or they are criticizing the Renaissance as harmful to the cultural health of the tradition on the grounds that the very concept of Renaissance is haunted by the spectre of cultural decline and decadence. So Jerry Carruthers and Cairns Craig present this perspective from their respective approaches. Craig and Carruthers oppose the declinist perspective of earliest critics such as Wittig and David Craig, but in doing so, I argue, they replicate some of the very faults of which they accused the Renaissance, the excising or marginalization of a particular cultural moment from the tradition for the betterment of the whole tradition. However, brilliant as they often are in their particular readings, part of the issue here for me is that these perspectives might really be different sides of the same coin, which focuses ultimately on the manner in which Renaissance is central in potentially positive or negative ways to the cultural health of the nation, a perspective that of course mirrors many of the Renaissance's concerns in its own period, and which was lent intellectual credence in the 1970s by the analysis of Tom Nairn, whose essay Old and New Scottish Nationalism has remained fundamental to contemporary readings, perhaps misreadings, of Scottish national culture, either implicitly, as in some of the readings I've just mentioned, or even more explicitly in some more recent critical and historical readings in which Nairn himself seems to be undergoing something of his own renaissance. In other words, what I call the pathologization thesis of the 1970s is still never far away in how we understand the role of Renaissance and revival in Scottish national life and letters. One route out from this is, I think, suggested in Michael Shaw's brilliant book, The Fanda Secula Scottish Revival, in its comparative internationalism and in the connections it draws between the late Victorian period, which, as Michael points out, it was castigated by the Renaissance, and the modernism of the Renaissance. But I also imply in my talk that we require more wide-ranging global comparisons and conceptualizations between different revival movements of our period in order to escape from, or to read more fruitfully, the eternal Renaissance dialectic of decline and rebirth. That's me.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you very much to all of our panelists for recapping their talks. There are so many different avenues and crossovers to explore. I suppose I'd like to start here, and this is something that came up in different forms in all of the different talks, and it's the question of how inclusive the revival was. And David, this is one of your sort of main points. You're stressing here that certainly the revival that sort of surrounded McDiarmid was sort of too limited, wasn't embracing the other as much as it could have. And yeah, I want to sort of ask the other panelists to sort of respond to that. Of course, David, feel free to jump in there as well, to think about, did the writers that you're focusing on in your papers, do they also feel marginalised from a sort of broader Scottish revivalism or a Scottish Renaissance? Or are they themselves perhaps limiting a form of revival? Or are they actually spreading it? Perhaps are they creating counter-revivals in response to the sort of McDiarmidian revival? So yeah, quite a lot of issues there in that question, but feel free to sort of jump on any that you want to explore. Maybe start off with Helena, actually, because I think there's interesting ways that women's writing relates, obviously, to the Scottish revival that centres around McDiarmid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know Juliet Shields made some really, really excellent points in her paper, was it in the last round of presentations, but just when you were speaking there, I think Willamuir's relationship with McDiarmid is particularly interesting. I mean, I don't think they had the best relationship. So I think for her, a lot of her feeling of exclusion came from feeling undervalued or compared to Edwin Muir in a lot of ways. I think particularly in terms of their translation work that they did together, and feeling as though her contributions were never taken as seriously or as valued as highly. And I think that, I mean, particularly in her diaries, that comes through really strongly, that she feels excluded. And there's certainly, even though she contributed a lot to the revival and was really engaged with other writers of the revival, I think in her personal letters there is a very strong feeling that she can't connect quite as strongly as she wishes to. But on the other hand, I think in her fiction, that's where a lot of not quite parody, but it's almost like an ironic way of looking at exclusion. That's an unfinished thought that I'm probably going to have to come back to, but I think Muir's relationship with McDiarmid is really interesting. Lorna Moon's relationship to the revival in general is quite an odd one, and I touched on that briefly in my paper. It's hard with Lorna Moon because she also died fairly young, so I don't really know what would have happened with her writing, how that would have developed. But I mean, from what I've seen of her, again, her private letters, she was more keen to distance herself deliberately from other Scottish writers. So, I mean, maybe that plays into what you were saying about creating their own new pockets of revival, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And yeah, I'm sorry also about the knock on the door there. That was my office. Things you have to learn when you're getting back into your office. A sign on the door saying that you're in a meeting. But yeah, I suppose a question to build on there is, do you think there was much, was there a sort of counter-revival in a sense between the women writers of the Renaissance, or the three that you've looked at? Is there much sort of evidence of sort of collaboration or interaction between them?
Really good question. I'm not sure. I mean, I know that there was certainly correspondence between a lot of the women writers, but I'm not sure how far it went in terms of a deliberate attempts to create a new revival. From what I've seen, there was a lot of providing feedback on each other's work, reviewing other women writers' work, but I'm not sure how much more I can speak to the other part of your question. I'm sorry.
No. I was asking it because of, yeah, in your paper you were discussing the fact that in the novels quite often we find sort of networks of solidarity between the female characters. So I was just wondering if that might have extended into their own lives and how that relates to the revival. But yeah, it'd be good to hear your thoughts, Petra, on this question of where these Gaelic writers are sitting in relation to the revival. And because in a sense the Gaelic revival is its own revival, but it's also sort of, it has a relationship to a broader national cultural revival. And yeah, is there much commentary in their works on sort of how they relate to that sort of wider canon?
Thank you very much, Michael, for the question. I would love to say more about this question of inclusivity, because to me it is quite fascinating that especially these two people who are, if they are, remembered as being very intellectual, elitist, cosmopolitan, that they were that, of course, but that they were very inclusive in different manners. I tried to mention that to an extent in my talk. So I mentioned the international inclusivity in terms of the magazines, inviting international contributors, covering international topics. I mentioned, the gender inclusivity, which relates especially to Derek Thompson. I also think it's very interesting to look at the inclusivity of the content of the magazines, because there was a strong preference for, new experimental literature, intellectual essays, but, they were also trying to cater for a very broad popular audience by including crosswords, travelogues, songs, the detective stories by Erskine of Mar. So I think, there was really, a marked effort to include popular audiences and to cater for them. In relation to Derek Thompson and inclusivity, I also wanted to mention that especially from the 1970s, we can observe his growing interest in the relations between Gaelic revival and Scots revival. So he was really reviewing a lot of new publications that deal with Scots language literature, and the revival of Scots, and was trying to envisage independent Scotland as a sort of ideal framework in which Gaelic and Scots and other traditions could flourish. And in relation to both of them, I think they were really seeing Gaelic Scotland and the Gaelic revival as part of Scotland as a broader framework, and for me, very importantly, in relation to Europe. So I would like to mention that in relation to the question of inclusivity as well. I hope that answers at least some of the points.
No, absolutely. And yeah, I think it it raises the question of, did the Gaelic revival do inclusivity better than a wider Scottish revival, in thinking about sort of the need to be popular and how to speak out to various different audiences rather than to limit or to prescribe a particular pure form. Yeah, I suppose, yeah, I mean, David, I don't know if you want to sort of elaborate on that, and it'd also be useful to hear about how the writers that you were looking at, whether they themselves, in trying to put forward a more inclusive idea of revival, how did they feel about their relationship to other revivals? Did they feel that they were excluded, or did they themselves feel part of that revival?
I'm not sure they're really bothered, to be quite honest. This is a difficulty that I always have, because I think there are large swathes of Scottish society, Scottish writing, Scottish culture, which has absolutely no idea that there's been a revival, and that there is current, this is in the period, in the interwar period, where there's been a revival and where there is an ongoing renaissance. I mean, most people, to most people, this is something that just simply doesn't exist. So I think a lot of writers, Bart, for example, who I said seems to me the most successful of the writers that I dealt with in my understanding of it, is certainly aware of other Renaissance writers. But as you maybe remember in the bit that I quoted from Major Operation, he also within a character voice and a narrating character's voice, he also sort of expresses extreme skepticism about the very nature of a Renaissance. The kind of, in some senses, it's the last thing that the people of Glasgow need, is anyone to tell them that they need to reconnect with their culture, they are the products of their history, because as far as they're concerned, they are the product of a set of commercial and relations which come from capital, as Bart would see it. And the other thing that I think makes the idea of Renaissance slightly redundant to many people is that how does Renaissance deal with immigration, people who come into Scotland, people who live in cities and want to express their cultures? And how does it speak the language that people speak when most people are now speaking a kind of form of American? How do you create a kind of Scottish cinema when cinema is an entirely new medium? So there are kind of, both in generic terms, in terms of things like cinema, but also in social terms, there's a lot of unprecedented experience going on here. So constantly to have to kind of refer it back to something which exists, or to some kind of sense of a Scottish spirit. My sense is there's a kind of impatience in this, in the people, particularly Dot Allen, I think, is again a very neglected writer, and her Hunger March is really worth looking at again. I think it's a desire to open themselves out beyond the parameters that the Renaissance were kind of, in some senses, understandably, I think, they were trying to defend themselves, trying to build a kind of stockade around Scottishness. And I think, I mean, that's obviously painting with a very broad brush to say that, but the novelists I'm talking about, I think, have got a very strong impatience to try to bring in the new media, to look at the novels, what's happening in international cinema, what's looking in international fiction, like the work of someone like John Dos Passos, and try and bring that into Scotland and broaden the scope of Scottish culture. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, which is a very long way to answering it, I think they were aware that they were excluded, but I'm not sure it bothered them too much, because they're working in a different environment. They're often working in a commercial environment. They were selling fiction to live, or to, I mean, I don't think, well, some of them didn't need to live, but certainly Bart needed to live by it, as did Blake. They lived by their pen, and that was the most important thing to them.
That's a fascinating point about the various forms of new media at this time, and yeah, how does a cultural revivalist handle those kind of forms of new media? Yeah, I'm sure people who work in film studies have a better answer to that. But yeah, does it rely on adaptation, or yeah, it's tough. But yeah, the other point that you were raising there is a useful one, on the fact that so many people in Scotland maybe just didn't know about the Scottish revival or Renaissance, or didn't care about it. And yes, Scott, I think, is there something to reflect on there in terms of the criticism on the Scottish revival? Is it, again, simply written for people who know about the Scottish revival, or are there any attempts to actually make the criticism a bit more accessible to try and broaden an awareness about revival?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I suppose for all his sins, McDermott, I guess, tried to do that in his sense of his propaganda for a Renaissance, because a lot of that does come through newspapers. A lot of that does come through him writing anonymously in newspapers to say this is happening at this particular time. So I think there is an attempt in that sense to kind of reach a kind of popular reader in some ways that seems perhaps to contradict probably what David was saying about how McDermott constructs Renaissance, or the idea of Renaissance in relation to an elite audience, which he does in particular magazines that he runs. I'm looking for a small audience, not a large audience, but so the persistent sense of McDermott's own contradictions, I think, comes over in that. I thought what David was saying there was really interesting about, all of that was really interesting, but about things like immigration as well. And also, when I was thinking about my talk, I mean, one focus of that, which I didn't really go into, was the ways in which we try and capture who is part of a kind of Renaissance movement and who is not, and why, and how that may slip and change over the years. I mean, at the time, I think McDermott himself does write about the likes of Blake, for instance. These writers are considered in that period, and I wonder to what extent there's been a sort of subsequent slippage of certain reputations. Helena's talk is interesting from that perspective. When I'm looking back at the criticism, Nan Shepherd doesn't really get a look in, actually, from lots of critics at all. And yet now, of course, we know her reputation has absolutely blossomed. So there are dips and troughs and peaks when it comes to kind of reputation and inclusion in a canon for what that's worth. And I suppose part of it is thinking, well, why might that be kind of the case? Because someone like Gibbon does a lot of the same stuff that David was saying the novelists he was focusing on do. The really interesting idea about polyphony and the way you're trying to capture various voices, that's something Gibbon's interested in doing in A Scots Quair. Chris is always a focalizer, but as we move towards Grey Granite, we get very much that more polyphonic view of things. So I wonder why some of those authors, the likes of Bark, perhaps, are more kind of ignored. Now, I don't really have an answer to that. I wonder if David has a kind of a sense of that. And equally, to flip that, Gibbon has some quite nasty views actually about cities, although that standout essay Glasgow is a kind of magnificent moment in Scottish scene. He does also say some pretty kind of snide things about Aberdeen in particular. So he's not immune to the kind of Renaissance elitism that is quite rightly kind of critiqued there, I think.
Do you want to follow up on those points, David?
Yeah, you're quite right about Gibbon being critical of the city, and I'm not. I mean, Bark is also highly critical of many of the people that he deals with. I mean, the kind of what became known as one of the works I didn't mention, which I really quite fancied talking about, and which I may try and do in a follow-up essay, is No Mean City, which again is, I think, a slightly underrated novel to some extent, because it is kind of written, at least half of it's kind of written from the point of view of the people who live in this place. So, I mean, I think the point that I'm kind of trying to make is that there are very strong, there are huge economic difficulties. You can't deny that in the 20s and 30s, Scotland was in a terrible economic place. So the problem with what we might call Renaissance is the attempt to find cultural solutions to this. And this is where Gibbon is really interesting, I think, in that essay on Glasgow, because he recognises that there is all sorts of viciousness in the Scottish scene, but he doesn't believe for a moment that there's a cultural, high cultural way out of this. That actually the way out of this is to simply understand what's going on and try and write about it, which ties them very closely into the other thing that's very prominent in the period that we tend to forget when we're dealing with Scotland in the 30s is the rise of the documentary movement, both in literature and in film. So I think a lot of these works are responding to a kind of documentary kind of idea that the first job of the writer is not to simply tell people in these places what they should think or feel, but to try and go and understand them. You know, there's a whole right through it. I mean, Scottish Journey is actually a part of that. Scottish Journey is written as part of a series in response to Priestley's English Journey. So there, you know, there's a vogue in British writing for writers to go to these places that have been neglected, that have been, you know, that have been left aside by high culture, and go and understand them. And I think that's the first purpose that the writers that I'm talking about at least are trying to do. I don't think they do it fully successfully. They don't necessarily always achieve what we might think of as finished works of art, but they're opening themselves up to the possibilities that they find there, and they're trying to define a kind of idea of what a Scottish experience might be based on what they find, rather than what they hope to find. As a kind of inductive process rather than a deductive process. And my kind of beef with, as Scott knows of old, my beef with people like MacDiarmid is that far too often it's the other way around. It's starting with an idea of Scotland and then measuring up to how people respond to that. So I think there's a really exciting movement going on, as is happening right across British culture, trying to find out what the culture actually is in Scotland, and then trying to sort of come to an understanding based on that. Sorry, that's probably going on too long, but that's more than you want to hear, maybe.
No. And I do want to follow up there on, this point that you're making in your paper about Glasgow not, or in the perception of some of these writers, in discussing that Glasgow wasn't sort of nourishing an aesthetic sensibility, or a place that high culture had sort of left behind. And I suppose from my position, focusing more on the 1890s, I've always found those sort of Renaissance characterizations just quite extraordinary, and thinking that just a few years beforehand, Glasgow was one of the places in the visual arts, at least, of high culture in Europe, and it was, you can make the argument, the most innovative visual arts centre in the UK. Is there much commentary on that in either sort of the Renaissance writers who are dismissing Glasgow, or in these Glasgow novelists? Because it does seem like a sort of an omission to not be sort of referring out to those contexts.
Yeah, just to say, I'm just kind of looking at the Q&A. I mean, Juliet Shields kind of essentially, I think, asks that question in the Q&A as well. I suppose just to pick up on that, the sense of, reflecting on the roles that geography played in the revival. Where did revival really happen, and where was it perceived to happen? If Glasgow was seen as a debased den of sin and the semi-rural was hostile to revival, was Edinburgh perceived as the only site of real revival? And how was the Gaelic revival coded in terms of geography? So I think that kind of sort of somewhat follows on from your question, Michael. I don't know who wants to pick up on that first. I mean, some of it, I suppose, is I can't really completely place the hostility to cities in Renaissance writers. It seems so extraordinarily extreme that it is one of the defining factors of that moment, and the hostility to the Reformation. Maybe there's some link, I don't know, but there's it's so extraordinarily extreme. It's difficult to kind of place that. Part of it, I think, is the rural background of the writers themselves. They, many of them, or most of them in that period, are from kind of small rural places. The typical example that's used is Edwin Muir, isn't it? Coming from Orkney and then comes down to Glasgow, and he undergoes a kind of propulsion forward 200 or 250 years, he says in his autobiography. So I think part of it is experiential. I think for those writers, that shock, not just of the new, but of a kind of urban new, and kind of what that means in relation to their own experience of those centres. Typically, again, the Renaissance is seen as being centred in smaller places, really. So often in the 1920s, you might kind of think of Montrose as being a kind of the centre of Renaissance really in that time. I don't think really you would read Edinburgh as being the centre of Renaissance particularly. They're much, you know, they're almost as hostile to Edinburgh as they are really to Glasgow in a different vein perhaps. But I think what's weird about it for me is the sense that they think there's a politics attached to that, which is an anti-capitalist politics. But it doesn't seem to stack up as an anti-capitalist politics in the way perhaps the writers that David was talking about in his talk would envisage that, because how it comes over in many Renaissance writers is really a hostility to the inhabitants of the city, rather than a hostility to the systems and structures that leave those inhabitants in such a difficult position. And I think that's what's kind of, I mean, just is, you know, quite difficult, I think, for us now to read in a kind of sympathetic way, I'd say.
Yeah, it'd be good to hear Helena and Petra's views on this, because yeah, obviously you're focusing on places that are, well, many of them are outside of the urban sphere. And yeah, do you, and I mean, to go back to Juliet's question, is there still some sort of association with the rural or semi-rural as hostile to revival? Or yeah, do you think that these sort of rural spaces are seen as more productive sites of revival?
No, not necessarily. It's strange because when I read Muir and Moon and Shepherd, I don't really get a sense that they're anti-urban or anti-Glasgow. I think that they have sort of a curiosity about cities. I don't know, we see some of the characters going to the city occasionally and then coming back. I think in Shepherd's A Pass in the Grampians, one of the characters, sorry, excuse me, one of the characters has quite a happy and successful life in the city, and it's when she comes back to her semi-rural community that there's this kind of tension of how do the two work together, rather than a distrust of one or the other, if that makes sense. I think for the writers that I'm looking at, not so much Moon, but Shepherd and Muir, there's more of an interest in Europe. And I think that links to what Petra was saying earlier, rather than being anti-city. It's quite it's a strange one. I don't think, I mean, their relationship with the semi-rural is quite difficult anyway. I think that they're all quite different. I mean, Muir doesn't see these places as particularly fruitful for women. And I think there's a sense that for women in these places to succeed, they have to get away from it. And that's what Muir did in her own life as well. She didn't stay in a rural place. She wanted to move as far away from that as possible. So I don't know. I'd like to hear what Petra thinks as well, but I think, yeah, I wouldn't say that they are intrinsically anti-urban, particularly these writers that I look at.
Okay, may I follow you? Thank you. I wanted to make several points because, in relation to the Gaelic revival, the geographies are very interesting because the highlands and islands are, of course, seen as a sort of repository of Gaelic language and culture. And both Erskine and Thompson very much involved in the revival, but they decided not to go there and not to live there. Thompson was from Lewis. Erskine was, of course, from Brighton, but they supposedly they both had the choice and decided not to do it, which prevents them from being identified as the voices of the region, in a way similar to the manner Sorley MacLean has been styled as the authentic voice of the region. Precisely, he wrote about the places and decided to live there. So both Erskine and Thompson are by choice associated with the city environment, and they were also using it to the benefit of their activities. And in the Gaelic context, Glasgow especially has this twofold role, both as a place of exile, as a place of emigration, but at the same time it is the city of the Gaels, the Gaelic centre in the lowlands. So there's this interesting double perspective. And I think, Derek Thompson is especially interesting to study in this respect, because he decided to live in Glasgow, and much of his poetry of place is dedicated to Glasgow. And in this poetry, he discusses both the tendencies he disapproves of, the spread of consumerism of English language popular culture, but he also sees it as a place of very exciting cultural exchange. And in some of his later poems from the 1990s, he is constantly looking for parallels to the Gaelic situation among the later incomers to Glasgow, among people from Burma or from Pakistan. So he is consciously making these parallels, and there is a lot of excitement about these new intersections and about these new exchanges.
Thanks very much. I really enjoy this idea of exile revivalisms, and it reminds me of is that quote from John Buchan on Violet Jacob, that this authenticity of Scots that only the exile can have. And there's maybe more for Scott and I to be thinking about that in terms of outsiderness and how that can actually be incredibly fruitful for revivalism, when for some people it's also a prejudice that they hold. Speaking about prejudice, this is just me again focusing more on the 1890s and Geddes, but it strikes me as a shift some of those prejudices. I'm thinking back to that essay that Scott was referencing, the Scots Renaissance, and one of the things that Geddes does there is he does bringing in lots of different groups. He sort of makes a sort of gesture out to Glasgow. He talks about Barry and Kirriemuir, and which is not just a reference out to the rural, but it's also a reference out to popular literature, and thinking about how the Caeliard could be part of a Scots Renaissance. So part of me wonders if there's a shift there while we're thinking about continuities. Is there perhaps a breakdown there in the sense that that sort of will to bring the others of Scotland together, they're maybe a bit more fragmented as we move into the Renaissance period? That's just more a hypothesis than a thesis at this stage, but there's maybe something to be said about it. I think another point I wanted us to comment on, which was covering a lot of your different papers, and we'll move into more of the Q&A, was around genre. Because several of you were commenting on the fact that we're commenting on genres, and I think Helena, you were making the point that part of the reason that these women writers have been overlooked is the sort of prestige that's been afforded to poetry, which obviously some women writers were writing poetry, but the ones you're focusing on were writing in fiction. I sort of wondered if others wanted to come in, or if Helena, if you wanted to develop on that point, to think about, is there a problem in terms of the revival, in terms of prioritizing certain genres, and or did the revival itself not do enough to sort of expand into other genres, or indeed to new media, as David was saying?
Well, if I can maybe come in there, if that's okay. This is to pick up on something that Carla's saying in her Q&A question. Perhaps this is a kind of problem of critical perception rather than actual, what's happening on the ground. First of all, I'm not sure I would agree that poetry is or was seen to be a culturally superior form. Let's put it that way. Maybe by some people, maybe by people like MacDiarmid, then it was. But I want to set that aside slightly, because I think certainly within genres, I think one of the problems that comes out of this period for Scottish writing, both in the lead up to the Second World War and after, is that you get a certain type of novel. Which is a sort of coming to consciousness novel, which is a product either of the Scottish condition or of partly of Renaissance itself. It's almost as if, so even in the post-war situation, I'm thinking of Gun here, and I'm thinking of Poor Tom and novels like that, and the Almanac, Macaulay's The Almanac, but also post-war novels like Fernie Bray or even The Dear Green Place. These are all kind of, it almost seems as though everyone's read James Joyce, Portrait of the Artist, and is doing a kind of version, doing their take on that. But so few people then go on and do the other thing which Joyce did, which was write Ulysses. I mean, that's when a culture really takes off. You know, you write your novel, which is a kind of a certain coming to self-consciousness, and then you run with it, kind of thing. And too many Scottish novels, in my view, were before Alistair Gray almost, you know, were tied into this kind of idea of a single novel of a sensitive individual fighting against their environment and trying to so not in terms of genre poetry versus the novel, but in terms of subgenres within novels, you tend to get a very kind of monotonous type of novel. I mean, I'm just being provocative here and saying this is obviously a great deal of novels which weren't like that, but the novels which tend to be valorized in criticism tend to be these types of novels. And that for me was a kind of problem, which I don't know whether it's to do with Renaissance or to do with just the particular nature of being a stateless nation in this period.
Well, that's a very modernist thing, isn't it? And I don't know if it's a particularly Scottish or peculiarly Scottish problem in that period. I think, as you say, there is a kind of portrait-esque element to what's going on there. So there is something quite modernist about the focus on the individual and the individual's kind of journey, I think, in that sense. But I mean, I suppose the novel that's probably the most valorized, perhaps the most valorized Scottish novel of all, but certainly in that period, is probably Sunset Song, which kind of does that, but kind of doesn't as well. So I think that's a kind of mixed bag, but I do know what you mean, but it's, I think that's a kind of modernist technique as much as it is a particularly Scottish problem in that period, maybe.
Yeah, and yes, we've thought about poetry and novels there. And yet one of the points that Petra, you were drawing attention to was Erskine feeling that there was an unfulfilled capacity for drama in Gaelic revival, which you referenced briefly. It'd be good if you could just tell us a bit more about what he thought that the potential of drama could be.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. There is this, call, for Gaelic drama and its employment in the revivalist cause that, really goes from Erskine of Mar, through Hector MacIver to Derek Thompson, and it still continues. So, it is an ongoing issue. I think, Erskine was, one of the first people to really formulate it in great detail, that, the drama, with its collective nature and the popular appeal would really, be used to great effect for the revival. And Erskine was coming up, with very specific ideas as to how it could be done, taking some elements from the Gaelic tradition and, working with them according to the latest European trends, proposing, the emergence of Gaelic symbolist drama, modeled on Maeterlinck and other writers. And he actually, wrote 2 pieces of drama himself, just to lead the way and, to show how it should be done. But it did not really work commercially. The plays were never staged. And so the call goes on. Erskine was, saying that Thompson made a similar point, in several of his articles, still recognizing this unfulfilled potential. He never wrote any drama himself. And I think, still nowadays, there is, much more Gaelic drama, more plays are being performed, but, still there seems to be this curious gap that has not been filled. So I think, his comments from the beginning of the 20th century are still very relevant.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And when you look over to Ireland in this period, it's very much seeing the potential of drama in revivalist efforts, both in Irish language, but then also in sort of cultural nationalist vein. And yeah, there are some attempts to bring that into Scotland, of course, through Erskine of Mar and then also through the Scottish Repertory Theatre. But Yeah, my feeling with a lot of these writers or a lot of revivalist figures is they're not quite tapping into what drama could do and the role that it could play in the Scottish revival. Yeah, so we'll move into the Q&A, unless any of the panelists have any questions that they want to ask of each other. We can move into one of the Q&A questions, and then, yeah, if there's other questions that you have, do feel free to bring them in. So yeah,
could I butt in then, seeing as, I mean, all I'm really doing is channeling the question that Glenda asked, and this is really to Helena, because I thought what she was saying was really interesting. And there's a really interesting question from Glenda about the way in which there's a kind of gender. I don't know if you can see it there, Helena, the question, but it's really sort of direct you in that, because I'd be really interested to hear how you, I've got kind of thoughts about this, but really interesting to hear what you think about this, considering that you dealt so specifically about female writers of the Renaissance.
Sorry, I'm just finding the question.
It's just the extent to which women, there's a kind of almost like a systematic kind of exclusion or a threat from women.
I can read it out, Helena, if that's useful.
Sorry, I'm very aware that everyone can just see my face staring blankly at the screen. Yeah, if you could read it out, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Useful for anyone else who's struggling to find the Q&A button. So yeah, Glenda, thank you for such rich presentations, so many insights. I was wondering if there are any ways in which Helena and David might connect their papers by thinking about the gendering of forms, and in particular, the different dynamics between women cultural producers and the popular. Thinking here about the ways in which two of the female figures in The Shipbuilders and George Anderson's wife in Major Operation, whose sign of weakness is a penchant for Neil Monroe, presented as culturally and nationally threatening, and how much this might relate to women writers in relation to the popular, both Emmeline in The Quarry Wood, with her fondness for peerage novels, and Moon's own positioning as a screenwriter, the greatest success with Mr. Wu. So, sorry for the long question. What kind of cultural hierarchies, inclusions, exclusions are operating in terms of gender and the popular? Very stimulating.
That's a great question. Thank you for reading it out. I think I'd have been there for ages. Oh, I don't really know where to start with that. That's a really great question. I think Moon's fascinating in general. Where to start with Moon though? I think Moon as a screenwriter, I mean, I unfortunately not managed to see any of the films that she wrote for. But I think from what I've seen of her her diaries and her letters to other people, she was very keen to market her work, both her fiction and I think there was hopes for Dark Star being adapted into a movie at some point, which unfortunately didn't happen, because I think it would be great if there are any screenwriters watching who want to adapt Dark Star. I think you should do it. Yeah, she was very keen to both downplay the role of Scotland, but also downplay how she could be compared to Scottish male writers. So Barry in particular, she really didn't want to be compared to, unless it was to say, I can't remember her exact wording, that she wanted to write as well as Barry, but not to be told that she writes like Barry. And she was also very keen not to be known by, she had tuberculosis, and she didn't want to be known as a sickly female writer who was writing on her sick bed with tuberculosis, and this is what she produced when she was sick. So Moon's really fascinating because she has a very clear vision of how she wants to be, well, how she doesn't want to be marketed and how she doesn't want to be presented. shepherd, I'm not too sure. I think I'm sorry. I will have. I really, this deserves so much more thought than I can give it at the moment. Maybe David, if you could step in, and I'll continue percolating thoughts as you're talking.
Well, no, I thought it was a great question, and it kind of reminded me of. I was trying to dredge back in my mind. There was a book that people used to read called The Theory of the Avant-Garde by Peter Berger, which I think made pretty much the same point, except about modernism, sort of saying that what modernism was opposed to was the feminization of literature, which meant the sort of the cheap stories that women were reading, the popular fiction, because to a large extent, popular fiction, the kind of things, a lot of things that Charlotte was talking about in the first week, were, you know, things like the Daily Mail, for example, being the first, was designed specifically for women readers. So there was a kind of sense in which the popular was seen as the female, and it was seen as somehow a kind of weakening of certainly many modernists and strenuous modernists, the kind of Wyndham Lewises of this world, saw this as actually fundamentally threatening to the kind of the integrity of the nation and the strenuousness of their purpose, kind of thing. So I think there's a really strong kind of, I think this, when we talk about modernism, you know, the kind of things that Marjorie Palmer McCulloch has written extensively about, and Scott's written about as well, about the impact of modernism in the Renaissance. I think you can see that coming through there. There's a kind of mistrust of the popular, partly because it's feminized. I don't think in Scotland it translates in quite those kind of terms, because I think even people like MacDiarmid are much more kind of conscious of the need to kind of be more inclusive, to use the word that Michael used at the start. But I do think there's actually another really confirms what Glenda's kind of saying. I think in the Albanach, again, there's a kind of wife, a pernicious wife, and her problem is that she reads tuppenny fiction. So again, you can see exactly that strategy being played out time and time again. So certainly for the more strenuous or the more masculinist side of Renaissance, then I think that kind of the popular and popular women's fiction was considered to be a bit of a threat, which is why it's interesting to see in the case that I was talking about Dot Allen writing a kind of a sort of very credible sort of popular fiction, which was strong and hard-headed and sort of serious fiction as well as being popular. So, you know, it doesn't always fall into that category, but I think there's a perception that this was sometimes happening. I don't know if that's what Glenda was getting at, but I sense that that's all there in the background somewhere. I mean, Scott may have views on this as well.
Yeah, I thought it was a great question as well, and I thought there were really good interactions between both you and Helena's papers, in a sense on that front that I kind of think is opened up by Glenda's question. I think you're right. Again, it seems a kind of background of modernism and modernist studies generally that these kind of questions seem to percolate. Although I also agree with you that it's not quite so explicit in Scottish terms as it perhaps is elsewhere, even in kind of MacDiarmid's writing perhaps as well. But yeah, I think also the point that Carla made in the chat is a kind of key one about, again, this is something I need to think about if I have to develop my talk into something much better, is the ways in which I think that gets then fed through in the criticism in subsequent decades from kind of the Renaissance onwards, you know, who's included, why they're included, and kind of what the focus of the criticism is. I think we're still kind of dealing with that in many ways, in the fact that we're still having these kind of conversations, really, in a sense. So I think that's a kind of important point as well. Yeah.
I'm just going to read out Ariana's question, which I think is especially talking about questions of decline, and wondering if this is mostly directed to Scott, but anyone feel free to come in. Yes, Ariana said, together these papers made me reflect on the relationship between the tensions that the revival expresses between the impulse to preserve and define an authentic Scottish culture and the processes of diversification or rupturing it on the one hand, and our own critical approaches to these tensions on the other. In seeking to build a more complex or inclusive picture of Scottish culture during the revival, how can we avoid the reproduction of the closed circuit of the eternal Renaissance dialectic of decline and rebirth that Scott identifies? And do we want to do so?
Good question. I don't know if we want to do so or not. I suppose some people would certainly want to do so. I suppose that's probably what we're maybe trying to do a bit with the network, isn't it, in a way? I suppose I don't know how we do that exactly, but I think part of that is to, think about these things in a way that doesn't entirely or completely relate to national narratives exclusively. I think that's what I was trying to suggest in my talk, that I think some of the same issues are reproduced elsewhere, and therefore they're not entirely to do with Scottish contexts and not entirely to do with some of the kind of limits potentially of Scottish critical narratives subsequently. But a lot of the kind of fault lines, as it were, that we've discussed today in relation to the Renaissance, or the Renaissance kind of view of the popular, are very much kind of modernist tropes. So I think a more concertedly comparative perspective in critical terms might kind of lift us out of the sense that what is being discussed are peculiarly or particularly kind of Scottish failures in that period. And those are perspectives that the Renaissance seems to have on the culture that I think can also be critiqued by not repeating the same fault lines. In other words, to look at the culture in a kind of purely isolated or national sense. So I think in critical terms, a kind of more concerted comparative approach, I think kind of might help in that sense, but also to be more inclusive in terms of our readings of the period as a whole. So reading the Renaissance, say, against the kind of broader cultural backgrounds of what's going on in that period, I think will be quite useful. And I think that's what we've been trying to do today. But putting those two things together in critical terms, I think would hopefully open things out as well.
Yeah, I suppose building on that, a sort of decentering of self-styled revivalists might be part of that as well, because they're those who are often trading in this idea of decline and rebirth, and perhaps through not sort of centering our attention on them so much, then that allows us to get around that dichotomy that pervades so much of the discussion. Yeah, great.
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, a few other questions. Just see at the bottom there. Oh, Murdo's asked, are there any thoughts on the psychological and or spiritual dimension of revival? E.g. Stuart Hood and Freud, Neil Gunn and Zen. Any writers that those of you have looked at that seem to trading in 1920s, the emergence of psychoanalysis or spiritual questions?
If I'm okay to jump in, I think both William Muir and Nan Shepherd are really in tune with modern psychology and also spirituality. I mean, Muir's imagined corners in particular, she's very interested in dreams and weaving dreams into everyday life and the impact of a dream, and almost psychoanalyzing her characters based on the dreams that they have and the ideas that they have. And I know that Muir was very interested in Freud, and you can see those ideas sort of transferring into her literature. And in terms of spirituality, well, not so much in Mrs. Ritchie. Mrs. Ritchie is more of just a 200-page warning against Christianity. But Imagined Corners, you do get these sort of new pockets of spiritual ideas coming out of a few characters. A lot of it's based on whether one person's God is the same as another. Who is praying to who, and will we get the same response back? And almost is God favoring men over women, and how do women respond to that? And then there are these ideas of spirituality coming out in terms of how you can relate to nature, and almost sort of creating your own spirituality and your own path to God in Imagined Corners, which is really fascinating. And then Shepherd, particularly in, sorry, my cat is just sort of very close to knocking my glass of water over. It's really off-putting. Where was I? Shepherd. So most of Shepherd's work is really focusing on finding self-knowledge and trying to really get to an understanding of who an individual is, or who she is in the living mountain. And there's that the phrase I am as I am and I can't be any amma, might be a slight misphrasing, but for her it's about reaching that I am and what that means. So again, we have these really interesting ways of looking at spirituality. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in.
Yeah, I suppose it's central to Shepherd, isn't it? And she discusses some of the Zen stuff with Gunn, doesn't she, really? And of course, The Living Mountains just become such a huge and important book in terms of eco-critical terms that you're kind of hooking up some of the sort of spiritual dimensions that Murdo's talking about there with a kind of new, more kind of pressing political and eco kind of perspective in Shepherd's work. Yeah, absolutely. Petra, are there ways in which that, spiritual kind of dimensions come through in Gaelic writers?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that, because I think both Erskine and Thompson are curiously unrelated, to evangelical Christianity, which is very closely related to Gaelic, and the relationship is of course quite problematic, because on the one hand there's this deeply ingrained image of the evangelical churches, stamping as hard as possible on the Gaelic language, the folk, secular Gaelic culture. On the other hand, it was exactly this religious environment where Gaelic had the chance to be used as an official language, as a language of learning, of intellectual discussion. So the relationship is very complex. And I think it is curious that neither in Erskine or in Thompson, this is much of an issue, because, like I said, Erskine was himself Catholic. And his, religious preferences are, very strongly manifested in his periodicals. With Thompson, it is not much of an issue either in Gaelic. So, it really curiously bypasses that dynamic, and he was himself dealing, with his complex relationship to the religious heritage of the Hebrides, and especially of Lewis in his poetry. So he discusses it critically, the cultural influence, the psychological influence, but it is not really much of an issue in relation to the vision of the Gaelic revival. So they are really, trying to do without it, which I think is, an interesting phenomenon in itself.
And this is something I haven't thought anywhere near enough about. Actually, it's a really interesting question, which sort of prompts you to thought, I think, in so many ways. Given in particular the importance that organised religion has had in Scotland since the original Renaissance, since the Reformation, the extent to which revivalism tries to find almost sublimated forms of religion. I mean, there's very little actual of your actual Presbyterian John Knox type religion in revivalism. Certainly, as far as I've come across, it's not as if we're all looking to get back to John Knox. I mean, I will say that one of the most disappointing aspects of Hunger Strike of Dot Allen's book is that it kind of ends up with it's got a strangely kind of religious ending, which sort of mars it slightly. It makes it sort of seem like it turns it into a kind of novel by Annie Swan or something like that, which is slightly off-putting for a modern reader, but that's only because a modern reader hasn't gone through that kind of process of, especially the evangelical literature, which was so popular in the late 19th century, and which was, Andrew Nash talked about the importance of evangelism behind evangelical religious publishers, behind things like Kailyard and that kind of thing, particularly Robertson Nicoll kind of thing. So as I say, I haven't thought enough about it, but it's quite significant, I think, that Major Operation kind of tries to kind of find a sublimated form of religion in a kind of martyrdom, a political martyrdom, rather than a spiritual martyrdom, but I think it's definitely there. I think what the revival is trying to do is to find ways of taking the kind of what's traditionally been accorded to, you know, the official organised religion of Scotland and doing something new with it, which is quite interesting. But as I say, I've no more to say because I've got nothing interesting more to say about it. But it's a great question.
Yeah, great. I'm looking at the time, actually. I've only got a few minutes left, so we'll just have a final question. Sorry, we haven't been able to engage with all of the questions, although panelists might want to follow up with some by email. There's a couple from Paulo, for instance, that are kind of on questions related to revivalism, but more about contemporary issues in teaching and politics that panelists might want to address. I see Charlotte's just posted on, if there's a connection between geographical periphery, i.e. emphasising life outside big Scottish cities, and the critical periphery in this period.
I'm just reading that question and don't fully understand it. I'm maybe being thick. So I'm not quite sure what Charlotte's kind of driving at there. So, connection between geographical periphery, emphasising life outside the big Scottish, and critical periphery, i.e. purporting an outsider's perspective on Scottish culture or art in the period. Yeah, I don't know. There may be some connections between that if Charlotte means kind of the Renaissance in that sense. But I think it's also that many of those writers thought genuinely that they were providing some sort of critique of capitalism in that period, but they were doing it from a perspective that just really has a kind of modernist, elitist kind of tone or taint to it, really, I think, in many ways. Suspect they just didn't really, as I say, biographically kind of understand or enjoy or relish kind of city life as well. It's not, you know, as David said in his presentation on that included analysis of Macaulay, I think that it just comes through in really quite a lot of their work in that way. There's either that relish for kind of a popular life or there's not, and they just didn't seem to have that, I think, in many ways.
Yeah, I think there's something actually, if you look back to the earlier sort of 1880s, 1890s revival, something quite similar. Even when they're living in cities, they kind of can't stand it and often want to sort of move beyond it. Although I suppose Geddes is an exception to that, who's really interested in the urban fabric and how to develop it. Okay, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Anna's asked a really good question, but I think it's one that, yeah, we're going to be developing, I suppose, over all of the sessions, which is, the words revival and Renaissance, and to what extent should we be using them synonymously, or are they useful as independent terms, which is a great question, which I think is a more overarching question for the whole project, which we'll develop on. But if we were to raise that just now, I think we'd be here for another half an hour. But yeah, no, thanks very much, Anne, for that question. Thank you to everybody for asking questions. Really, really interesting and stimulating discussion. And a huge thank you to our panelists for brilliant papers and really engaged and supportive commentaries and discussion today. So a big virtual round of applause to our panelists. And yeah, our next session will be focusing on Patrick Geddes, where Murdo MacDonald, Elsa Richardson and myself will be presenting, and that will be in collaboration with the Patrick Geddes Centre. So yeah, there'll be more information about that. I think we planned it'll be sometime around about May or June, but we're yet to firm up an exact date and details around that. So we'll be in touch in the future about that. So yeah, if there's nothing else, we shall wrap up there. Thanks for coming along, everyone. As I said, there will be an abrupt ending very shortly to the discussion, but thanks again for coming.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Great discussion. Thanks very much.